They say the bravest thing a person can do is stay. But sometimes, and this is the part nobody tells you, the bravest thing a person can do is run. Not from cowardice, not from weakness, but from a love so enormous and so terrifying that your entire body interprets it as danger. Because every great love you have ever had has eventually become the thing that almost finished you. Helen Paul knew this. She had built her whole second life on this knowledge. And so when the universe handed her the most impossible, the most beautiful, the most devastating gift she had ever received, she did the only thing her frightened, fierce, deeply human heart knew how to do. She ran, and she took his baby with her. It started on a Wednesday morning, the kind of ordinary Wednesday that has no business changing your life. Helen was in the small bathroom of the apartment she and Soyeon shared, getting ready for an early shift, when she noticed the date on her phone, and then did the math, and then stood very still for approximately 4 minutes doing the math again, because the first answer could not possibly be correct. She bought 3 tests. She took all 3. All 3 said the same thing. She sat on the edge of the bathtub with the tests in her hand and thought about absolutely nothing for a very long time. Then Soyeon knocked on the door and said, "엄마, I'm hungry." And Helen stood up, put the tests at the bottom of the bathroom bin under several layers of tissue paper, washed her face, opened the door, and made her daughter breakfast with perfectly steady hands. She was 42 years old and pregnant. She did not call Minho. Not that morning. Not that afternoon. Not that evening when he called her and they talked for 40 minutes about Minjun's school project and Soyeon's new obsession with butterflies and the restaurant he wanted to take her to on Friday. She laughed in all the right places. She asked the right questions. When he said goodnight and told her he loved her in that quiet, certain way that still undid her every single time, she said it back and meant it completely, and hung up the phone and sat in the dark of her living room and felt the full weight of the impossible thing pressing down on her chest. A baby. His baby. Inside her body. At 42. She told herself she would tell him tomorrow. Tomorrow became 3 days. 3 days became a week. A week became 2. And somewhere in those 2 weeks, the fear, which had started as a small, cold thing in her chest, grew into something that filled every room she walked into. Because here is what Helen understood that nobody around her could fully see. This was not a simple pregnancy. This was a pregnancy inside the Kang dynasty. This was a child who would be born into the most powerful and the most dangerous family structure in South Korea. This was a baby who would carry a target on its back before it could even hold its own head up. She had already watched Park Sung-ho use her love for Soyeon as a weapon. She had already sat in a courtroom fighting for the right to keep her daughter. She had already received flowers that were actually death threats. And now, she was supposed to bring another life into that world? A life that would be bound to it by blood, irrevocably, forever. She lay awake at 3 in the morning and did the math a different way. And the different way terrified her more than anything Park Sung-ho had ever done. She also understood something about Minho that she had never said out loud. He was a man in the process of transformation. She could see it, the way you can see a season changing if you pay close enough attention. The slow warming, the first green things pushing through. He was trying, genuinely and with everything he had, to build something different. But the old world did not let men like him go easily. It held on. It had claws. And she had watched him carry that weight every single day, smiling at her across kitchen tables and park benches, while underneath, he managed an empire that operated on fear and controlled violence. She loved him, completely. But love does not make a dangerous thing safe. It just makes you willing to stand closer to it. And she could not, she would not, hand a newborn baby to danger and call it fate. She booked the flights on a Saturday night after Soyeon fell asleep. Accra, Ghana. 2 tickets, 1 week from today. She told the hospital she needed emergency family leave, which was true in its way. She called her mother, who had been praying for this phone call for 3 years, and said, "Mama, I'm coming home." And her mother made a sound on the phone that was half sob and half hallelujah. She did not call Ji-yeon until the night before the flight. Ji-yeon picked up on the second ring, and Helen told her everything. The tests, the weeks of silence, the flights, all of it, in one long, steady stream, the way people confess things when they have been holding them too long. There was a silence on the other end that was heavy with everything Ji-yeon wanted to say and was choosing not to. "You're not going to tell him before you go," Ji-yeon said finally. It was not a question. "No," Helen said. "Helen, I know. He's going to—" "I know, Ji-yeon." Another silence. Then, "How long?" "I don't know," Helen said honestly. "I just need to think. I need to be somewhere that feels like me, where I can breathe and think without his world pressing on every side, and figure out what is right. Not what is easy, what is right." Ji-yeon was quiet for a long time. "I won't lie to him," she said finally. "If he asks me directly, I won't lie." "I'm not asking you to lie," Helen said softly. "I'm just asking you to give me a little time." She hung up and went to check on Seoyeon, who was asleep in her fairy-light bedroom with a stuffed butterfly clutched to her chest. Helen stood in the doorway for a long moment, memorizing it. Then she finished packing. The hardest moment, the moment she almost turned around entirely, was at 6:15 the next morning, when her phone lit up with his name. Just his name, glowing on the screen in the quiet of the taxi to the airport. Seoyeon, asleep against her shoulder. She stared at his name for the full duration of the ring. She did not answer. The phone went dark, and she pressed her cheek against the top of Seoyeon's head, and closed her eyes, and told herself she was doing the right thing. She told herself that for the entire 14-hour flight. She was still telling herself that when the plane descended over Accra and the landscape opened up below them, red earth and green trees and the wide shimmer of the Atlantic. And something in her chest cracked open in a way that was not grief, but was related to it. Home. She had forgotten how much she needed it, how much of her had been left here waiting. If you're already feeling this story in your soul, go ahead and like this video right now, because we haven't even gotten to the part that will break you yet. Her mother was waiting at arrivals. Margaret Paul, 68 years old, wrapped in yellow and green kente cloth, the most solid and beautiful woman Helen had ever known, who took one look at her daughter coming through the doors, tired, thinner than she should be, carrying a sleeping Seoyeon and an expression that only a mother can read, and opened her arms without saying a single word. Helen walked into them, and for the first time in 11 weeks, stopped holding everything up by herself. She cried in her mother's arms in the middle of Kotoka International Airport, while Seoyeon woke up confused, and immediately started patting Helen's back in comfort. Because Seo-yeon was 4 years old and had learned from the very best that when someone you love is hurting, you put your hand on their back and you stay. Her mother's house was everything Seoul was not. Warm and loud and full of colour, the smell of contomere stew coming from the kitchen, her mother's garden a riot of bougainvillea and hibiscus, the sound of the neighbourhood mixing with birdsong through the open windows. Seo-yeon, who had been subdued on the plane, took one step into the garden and became a completely different child. She ran between the flowers with her arms out, like she was trying to catch the air itself. "She's beautiful," her mother said, watching Seo-yeon from the doorway. "She is everything," Helen said. Her mother looked at her sideways with the precision of a woman who has known her daughter for 42 years. "And the baby," she said quietly. Not a question, because mothers know. Helen turned to look at her. "How long have you known?" Helen asked. "Since you called me and said you were coming home," her mother said simply. "You haven't come home in 3 years, Helen. Something had to be either very wrong or very right. And you don't look like something is very wrong." She paused. "You look like something is very right. And it terrifies you." Helen looked at the garden where Seo-yeon was attempting to make friends with a lizard on the garden wall. "He's complicated," she said softly. "All the good ones are," her mother said, and went back inside to check on the stew. Back in Seoul, Kang Minho had not slept in 4 days. He had arrived at Helen's apartment building on the morning she left, having gotten no answer to his calls, with the low-grade unease of a man whose instincts have kept him alive for 46 years, and were currently screaming. The building manager, uncomfortable under the weight of his attention, had told him she left with luggage. Early that morning, with the child. He stood in the empty lobby and felt something he had not felt since the night Ha-eun died. Not grief, something more immediate than grief. Something cold and clarifying that a man in his position is never supposed to feel. Fear. He called Ji-yeon. She answered, and he could hear from the first syllable that she knew exactly where Helen was, and that she was not going to tell him. "Is she safe?" he asked, because that was the only question that mattered in the first moment. "She is completely safe," Ji-yeon said carefully. "Minho, she needs time. She's not—" She stopped herself. "She's safe. I promise you that." He closed his eyes briefly. The fear became something more manageable. Then he said, very quietly, "Did she tell you why?" Ji-yeon was silent for 3 full seconds. "She'll tell you herself," she said. "Give her time." He did something then that was deeply uncharacteristic. He nodded, to himself, alone, in his empty car outside her building, and said, "Okay." Because he had learned from her that some things cannot be forced. That the only way to show someone you are safe is to prove it when it is most difficult. And waiting, really waiting, without pressure, without pursuit, without using his considerable resources to simply find her and appear, was the hardest possible proof he could offer. He waited 3 days. On the 4th day, Minjun asked why So-yeon hadn't called. On the 5th day, Minho found one of So-yeon's small hair clips on the floor beside his kitchen table and sat at that table for a long time holding it between his fingers. On the 6th day, he called Ji-yeon again, and this time he didn't ask where Helen was. He asked, "Is there something I should know? Something she was afraid to tell me?" Ji-yeon's silence this time was different. Longer, weighted with something. "Ji-yeon," he said. "Minho, I can't—" "Is she sick?" His voice did not change temperature, it never did, but his hand tightened on the phone. "She's not sick," Ji-yeon said. And then, because she had promised she would not lie if asked directly, "She's not sick, she's the opposite of sick." Another pause. "That's all I can say. I'm sorry." He sat with that for exactly 30 seconds. The opposite of sick. His mind, trained for 30 years to process information at speed and arrive at correct conclusions faster than anyone in the room, arrived at the conclusion in those 30 seconds and then sat completely still with it. He booked the flight to Accra that evening. He didn't tell anyone except his head of security, who accompanied him to Incheon Airport at 5 in the morning with the expression of a man who had seen his boss do extraordinary things, but was genuinely surprised by this particular one. "Ghana, sir," the man said, as if confirming he had heard correctly. "Ghana," Minho confirmed, and walked through the departure gate in a dark coat with nothing but a carry-on bag and the expression of a man who has made an absolute decision. He had Ji-yeon's slip, the opposite of sick, and he had Helen's voice in his memory saying, "I'm too old for love," with the conviction of someone who had given up on something they secretly still wanted. He thought about how she moved through the world, always practical, always prepared, always building the walls back up the moment she felt something coming that she couldn't control. He thought about how the only thing that had ever made So-yeon trust her was that she had simply stayed, every single day, until the child believed she wasn't going anywhere. He thought, she ran because she loves something too much and is afraid of what that means. And the only answer to that is to show up. He found her mother's address through means that were his own business, and he stood outside a yellow house in a quiet Accra neighborhood on a Thursday afternoon, the Ghana sun completely indifferent to the significance of the moment, bougainvillea rioting over the garden wall in purple and orange, the sound of a child laughing somewhere behind the gate. He rang the bell. The woman who opened the gate was not Helen. She was older, rounder, wrapped in bright cloth, with Helen's eyes and Helen's posture, and the expression of a woman who had been told about him and had formed opinions. Margaret Paul looked at this tall Korean man in a dark coat standing in front of her garden in the Accra afternoon heat and said without greeting, "You're Minho?" "I am," he said. "Mrs. Paul, I apologize for arriving without warning. I would like to see your daughter." Margaret looked at him for a long, measured moment. The same way Madame Kang had looked at Helen, he realized. Mothers of complicated people have the same eyes. "She's in the garden," Margaret said finally, and stepped aside. He walked through the gate, and there she was. Helen was sitting on a low wooden bench in the middle of the most beautiful, chaotic garden he had ever seen, wearing a simple yellow dress, locks loose around her shoulders, her face turned towards So-yeon, who was chasing a butterfly through the hibiscus with total commitment. The afternoon light in Accra was different from Seoul light, warmer, more golden, more ancient somehow. And it fell across Helen in a way that made her look like something painted rather than real. She had not heard the gate. She had not heard his footsteps on the garden path. He stopped walking. He just looked at her for a moment. And in that moment, he saw what 2 weeks had done. She was calmer, more settled in her body, more herself than she had been in months. She was also, now that he was looking with the understanding he had arrived with, visibly different in ways that confirmed everything he had suspected. Not dramatically, not obviously, but to someone who was paying attention, and he was always paying attention, the quiet fullness of it was unmistakable. So-yeon saw him first. "Appa!" she screamed, with the full-body delight of a 4-year-old who has been missing someone and does not yet understand that adults complicate things. She came running across the garden at full speed, Butterfly completely forgotten, and he caught her as she launched herself at him, lifting her up against his chest, her small arms strangling his neck. Helen turned. The expression on her face went through 6 things in approximately 2 seconds. Shock, then something raw and undefended, then something that looked almost like relief, then the shutters coming down as the practical part of her tried to take back control, then the shutters failing entirely, then just her. Just Helen. Looking at him with So-yeon between them, in her mother's garden in Accra, in the golden afternoon light, with no walls left to hide behind. "Minho," she said. Her voice was barely there. "Hello, Helen," he said. So-yeon, from her position in his arms, looked between the 2 adults with the uncomplicated assessment of a 4-year-old and said, "Amma is crying." Helen pressed her lips together. "I'm not crying." "Your eyes are wet," So-yeon said helpfully. He set So-yeon down gently, and she immediately ran to find her grandmother, because children have instincts too, and this garden was about to need some privacy. They stood 10 feet apart in the flower-filled afternoon and looked at each other. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Ji-yeon didn't tell me," he said immediately, because he knew that would be the second question. "She told me nothing except that you were safe. I found this address through other means, and I take full responsibility for that." She nodded slowly. Her hands were folded in front of her. He noticed, because he noticed everything about her, that she had placed them deliberately low. Not quite over her stomach, but close. "I was going to tell you," she said. "I know," he said. "I just needed to—" "I know," he said again. His voice was not angry. It was not cold. It was the voice he used when something mattered too much for performance. "Helen, I am not here to make you feel guilty. I am not here to demand anything. I am here because you are carrying something alone that you don't have to carry alone. And I needed you to see me standing in front of you saying that, because I don't think you actually believe it yet." Her composure, already fragile, developed a crack she couldn't close. "It's not your world that I'm afraid of," she said, and her voice was barely steady. "I've made my peace with your world. It's the baby, Minho. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a child who will be born knowing things a child should not have to know. So-yeon, I chose that. I walked into her life knowing what I was bringing her into. But this baby..." Her voice broke slightly. "This baby didn't choose anything yet. And I sat in that apartment in Seoul for 2 weeks trying to figure out how to protect something I already love more than I know how to say. And I could not find the answer. And so I came home because this is where I come when I need to find answers." He crossed the 10 feet between them. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she would have to actively step away if she didn't want his proximity, and he looked at her with an expression that had nothing in it except truth. "I have been afraid of one thing my entire adult life," he said quietly. "Not rivals, not enemies, not losing the business or the syndicate or any of it. The one thing that has kept me awake, the real thing underneath all the control and the walls and the 15 years of careful silence, he paused, is that I would love something so much that losing it would finish me. Ha-un finished me. I built myself back, but barely. And then you arrived in a hospital corridor and started it all over again, and I knew from the very first park bench that this one would be worse. That you were the one that would completely end me if it went wrong. She was listening with her whole body. And then you left, he said, and I spent 6 days in Seoul holding a hair clip that belongs to a 4-year-old girl who I love as my own daughter. And I understood something. He looked at her steadily. I am not afraid anymore. Because losing you, the version of losing you where I let fear win and don't fight for this, is worse than any other version. There is no safe distance from loving you, Helen. I tried that for 15 years. I'm not going back. The crack in her composure became something irreparable. The baby, he said very softly. Our baby. I want to know everything. When you found out, what you felt, how many weeks, I want to know all of it. Not because I'm entitled to it. Because you are the person that I have chosen, and that means I want every piece of what you carry. Even the terrifying ones. She put her face in her hands. The sound she made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and it was the most honest sound he had ever heard from a human being. He put his arms around her. She let him, completely. Her forehead against his chest, his arms holding her in the Accra afternoon, while purple bougainvillea moved in the warm breeze around them. And somewhere in the house, her mother was almost certainly listening from behind a curtain, and absolutely not apologizing for it. 11 weeks, she said, muffled against his chest. 11 weeks, he repeated, like it was a sacred number. I'm 42, Minho. There are risks. There are so many. We will face every risk together, he said. With the best doctors on the planet, I promise you. Your world. I have been thinking about this, he said, and she felt the steadiness of it in his voice, the preparation, the way he never said something he hadn't fully thought through. The syndicate. I have been building a transition for 3 years, a legal one. I was waiting until it was complete before I told you, because I didn't want it to seem like a gesture. But Helen, I am getting out. Not for you. For the child Soyon called me Appa in front of me, and I realized I could not let that word live in the same world as the other thing I am. I have already started. It will take time, but it has already started. She pulled back to look at him. Her eyes were searching his face for the truth of it. You're serious, she said. I have never said anything to you that I didn't mean, he said simply. She looked at him for a long time in the golden afternoon light of her mother's garden. And she made a decision. Not the practical kind, not the careful kind, but the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than calculation. The kind she had been slowly learning to trust again since a park bench in Seoul. She took his hand and placed it flat against her stomach. He went completely still. His hand on her stomach, her hand over his, both of them standing in a garden in Ghana, 10,000 kilometers from the city that had brought them together. While a 4-year-old somewhere in the house explained loudly to her grandmother that Appa had arrived and Oma's eyes were wet. Hello, he said softly, to the thing too small to hear him, but that he was already speaking to. His voice was different than she had ever heard it, stripped of every layer, just a man meeting something new and sacred. She watched his face and thought, this is the moment. This is the one I will remember when I am old. this garden, this light, this man with his hand on the beginning of our family. You followed me across the world, she said softly. He looked up at her. I would follow you further than that. She laughed, properly, the big, unashamed laugh that he had once told her was the first thing that had broken through his walls. He caught it on his face like light. I want to meet your mother, he said. She's already met you, Helen said. She's been watching from that window for the past 10 minutes. He turned. In the window of the yellow house, a woman in bright kente cloth very smoothly moved away from the curtain with great dignity. He laughed, a real laugh, and Helen realized in that moment that she had never heard him laugh like that, full and unguarded and surprised by itself, and that it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard from him. They stayed in Accra for 2 weeks, 2 weeks that rewrote everything. Because Accra did something to Minho that Seoul never quite could. It stripped away the architecture of his power. There was no penthouse here, no syndicate, no empire. There was Margaret Paul's kitchen and her opinions and her jollof rice that she watched him eat 3 helpings of on the first evening with an expression that suggested he had passed a significant test. There was the neighborhood, noisy and alive and completely unaware of who he was. There was So-yeon dragging him through the market with the authority of a child who has decided you are hers, pressing mangoes into his hands and telling him to smell them. There was Helen, a version of Helen he had not yet met, the one who existed before Seoul, before the heartbreak, before the careful rebuilding. Looser, louder, more rooted. She spoke differently here, a Ghanaian lilt returning to her English that she normally kept contained, and he found himself listening to it for hours, wanting to memorize it. On the 5th evening, he sat with her mother on the veranda after dinner, while Helen bathed So-yeon inside. The city hummed around them. Margaret handed him a cup of tea and looked at him with the direct assessment she had been refining for 68 years. You hurt her, she said, not unkindly. And I don't mean on purpose. I mean that your life hurt her, before you even knew she existed. She came home 2 years ago, and I watched her put herself back together piece by piece. She is not a woman who breaks easily, but she breaks deeply. I know, he said. The baby will need a father who is present, she said. Not powerful, not rich. Present. I intend to be, he said. Margaret looked at him over her teacup. She told me you're getting out, she said. Yes. How long? 18 months for the full legal transition. Certain elements are already complete. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then, she's been alone a long time. She became very good at it. Good enough that she stopped noticing how much it cost her. She paused. Don't let her become good at it again. No, he said quietly. I won't. Margaret nodded once, slowly. Good, she said, and refilled his tea. He proposed on the 14th day, not grandly, not with a rooftop or an expensive setting. He proposed in the garden, in the morning, while So-yeon was still asleep, and the bougainvillea was catching the early light, and Helen was standing at the garden wall with a cup of tea, looking at the street waking up outside. He had the ring. He had bought it in Accra's jewellery quarter on the 3rd day, a simple, extraordinary ring, with a single deep-coloured stone, the exact shade of the Accra afternoon when he had first walked into this garden and seen her. He said her name. She turned. He held up the ring, and his face had nothing on it except the truth. "I know your concerns," he said. "I know your fears. I share most of them, and I take the rest seriously. I am not asking you to stop being afraid. I am asking you to be afraid with me, next to me, where I can see you and you can see me, for the rest of our lives." He paused. "Helen, you told me you were too old for love. I have spent months proving that wrong, and I intend to spend decades finishing the job. Marry me. Build this with me. Let me be Appa for real, to So-yeon, and to whoever is currently making you tired and nauseous, and more beautiful than I have words for." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. The sun was coming over the garden wall, and the bougainvillea was purple and orange fire around them, and somewhere in the house, So-yeon would wake up soon and say, "Appa," with that casual ownership that still wrecked him completely every time. "You flew to Ghana," she said. "I did. With one carry-on bag. I didn't need much. You ate 3 helpings of my mother's jollof rice. It was exceptional." "She told me," Helen said, the smile beginning. "Say yes," he said quietly. She crossed the garden. She took the ring from his fingers and put it on her own hand, and then looked at it on her hand for a moment. The stone caught the morning light and threw it back in deep, warm fire. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He pulled her close and she went, and they stood in the garden that had witnessed all of it. The confession, the revelation, the reunion, the beginning of the real beginning, while the Accra morning opened around them like something that had been waiting. If you've been watching since part 1 and you're here with me right now in this moment, please like this video and leave a comment below. This story belongs to all of us. 6 months later, they named her Nana Ji-young Kang. Nana for her Ghanaian grandmother, who cried so hard at the naming ceremony in Seoul that Margaret had to be given water and a chair. Ji-young because Minho had asked Helen to choose a Korean name, and she had spent 3 weeks on it with the same focused devotion she brought to everything she loved. She was born at Seoul National Hospital, the same hospital where it had all begun, in a corridor in the rain, with a woman who didn't know she was someone's beginning. She was born healthy and furious, which the nurses agreed was a very good sign. She had her father's jaw, already strong and opinionated at 4 hours old, and her mother's eyes, deep, warm, seeing everything. Minho held her in the delivery room and could not speak for a full 2 minutes. He simply stood there, with this new human being in his arms, while Helen watched him from the bed with an expression of complete and unashamed love. And somewhere in the corner of the room, Ji-yeon was crying openly and not apologizing for it. So-yeon met her sister that evening. She came in wearing the outfit she had chosen herself, a dress with butterflies on it, obviously, and approached the hospital bassinet with enormous solemnity and looked in. Nana Ji-young blinked up at her. So-yeon turned to Helen with wide eyes. "She looks like Appa," she said. "She does a little," Helen agreed. So-yeon looked back at the baby. Then she put one gentle finger into the baby's hand, and Nana Ji-young, as newborns do, gripped it immediately. So-yeon's face transformed completely. "Omma," she breathed. "She's holding me." "She knows you already," Helen said softly. "She was waiting to meet you." Minho stood against the wall of that hospital room with the Han River visible through the window behind him and watched his family, this extraordinary, improbable, irreplaceable family, and felt the exact opposite of everything he had felt in this building on the night it began. That night he had stood in a doorway and felt something knock on a door he thought was sealed. This night, every door in him was open, every room lit. He thought about Helen standing in the rain outside this building, holding a child that wasn't hers by blood, and telling herself that some doors close forever. He thought about what it had cost her to run, and what it had cost him to follow, and how sometimes the story takes the long way around, not to punish you, but to make sure you arrive understanding the full value of what you've been given. He looked at his wife. They had married quietly 3 months ago, in a ceremony that had Margaret Paul dancing, and Madame Kang crying into a silk handkerchief, and Min Jun and So-yeon as ring-bearer and flower girl, both taking the assignment with extreme seriousness. He looked at So-yeon, with her finger in her sister's fist. He looked at Nana Ji-young, jaw set, eyes taking in the world with an expression that already said, "I have opinions, and I intend to share them." He crossed the room and sat beside Helen on the hospital bed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched their daughters meet each other in the lamplight. "Too old for love," he said quietly. She made the sound, half laugh, half something deeper. "I was wrong." "Catastrophically," he agreed. She turned and kissed him, brief, certain, the kind of kiss that belongs to people who have stopped performing love and simply live inside it. Outside the window, Seoul blazed with its million lights, loud and indifferent and full of stories. Inside this room, one of those stories reached a place that was not an ending, but a different kind of beginning. The beginning that comes after you have survived every version of yourself that was afraid and discovered, on the other side of all that fear, that what was waiting was simply this: warmth, fullness, a family that did not happen to you, but was chosen, piece by piece, with everything you had. A woman who said she was too old for love. A man who crossed the world with one carry-on bag to prove her wrong. And 2 little girls in a lamp-lit hospital room, one holding the other's hand, already beginning the story that would be entirely their own. If Part 2 moved you more than Part 1, if you felt every moment from Accra to that hospital room, then this channel is your home. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Leave a comment and tell me, what moment in this story broke you the most? The garden proposal? Nana Ji-young's arrival? Or So-yeon saying, "She's holding me"? I read every single comment. Part 3 is coming, and you are not ready. See you there.